Okay, welcome everybody to this evening's, I've already forgotten what it's called, Books That Changed Humanity series. This evening our guest is Professor Meredith Rossner, who is a professor of criminology in the Center for Social Research and Methods here at the ANU. Now let me begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose land I think Meredith and I are both speaking from this evening, and acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Meredith is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of the book Just Emotions, Rituals of Restorative Justice, published by Oxford University Press, as well as many chapters and journal articles. And Meredith conducts research on emotions, rituals, and technology in the criminal justice system. And this research has included investigations into restorative justice, jury deliberations, and therapeutic courts. But today, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're discussing Erving Goffman's classic, The Presentation of the Self in Everyday Life. And when Meredith has finished her presentation, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. But because we're using the webinar format, I'll invite you to use the Q&A or the chat functions at the bottom of your screen. So I'm happy to hand over to Professor Meredith Rossner.
Thanks, everyone. I also want to acknowledge that I am here in Canberra, in Ngunnawal country, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to share my screen and just, I guess, let me know if it doesn't work. Does that seem okay? Can you guys see the right? I guess Ibrahim can send me a cue if it doesn't. Great. Fab. Thank you so much for having me here today. And I'm really, really looking forward to talking about this book for the next little while. And indeed, those of you who are already familiar with this will know that it's a very fitting medium for today's topic on the presentation of self, to have me trying to engage with you guys over Zoom. And the nature of video interaction is something that I hope we can return to. So today I'm going to introduce you to a book that I think changed humanity. The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. So in rereading this book to prepare for today, I came upon a really brief passage that I think encapsulates what is so subtly powerful about Erving Goffman's insights. So Goffman did his fieldwork for his PhD in the Shetland Islands in Scotland. And he describes in his book a very common practice that he observed during his fieldwork, which is that when someone drops around for a cup of tea, it's very normal for a visitor, and think of yourself in this situation. It's normal for a visitor to have an expectant, warm smile on their face as they pass through the entry door. So communicating, warmth and kind of good humor. But because in Shetland, and this is an example of a cottage in the Shetland Islands, because of the lack of trees and long approach, it's very possible to see your visitor long before they're at your door. And Goffman noticed that people take pleasure in watching the visitor drop whatever expression he was manifesting and replacing it with a sociable one just before reaching the door. However, potential visitors conned on to this, and they would, to quote him, blindly adopt a social face a long distance away from the house to ensure the projection of a constant image. Now, does that resonate with you? Can you think of situations where you've been putting on your game face just in case an unobserved observer is observing you? Or can you think of a time that you took pleasure in catching someone else preparing themselves to interact with you? How did this make you feel? What did you do? Well, according to Goffman, and this is a quote from him, this kind of control upon the part of the individual reinstates the symmetry of the communication process, and it sets the stage for a kind of information game, a potentially infinite cycle of concealment, discovery, false revelation, and rediscovery. So that's like a really tiny example about the minutiae, right, of everyday life. But I think that captures a really large part of Goffman's big insight. Across a whole range of works, and this book I'm going to talk about today is the first one, Goffman explores the minutiae of everyday interaction, unpacking in detail how this information game is played. So Goffman's book was published in 1959, and a lot of sociology at that time, at least in America where the discipline was thriving, was concerned with like macro level theories, developing large scale theories of social structure. The discipline was also increasingly occupied with asserting itself as a scientific discipline that valued statistical rigor, generalizability, and so on. This book, and all of Goffman's books, really refocus us. He asks us to zoom in on the micro, the everyday, the mundane, but his conceptual point is that this zooming in reveals to us something about the contours of the larger social structure. This book is an example of what some scholars have called an anti-disciplinary text. It's ambitious, full of big ideas and bold claims. It's scholarly and erudite, but it's written for both academics and a general public. As Dalston and Marcus note, these are scholars who write about anti-disciplinary texts. Such texts challenge the diction, scope, and preoccupation that keep branches of knowledge distinct. Their claims encompass continents and centuries, ignore the controversies raging in specialist journals, and are formulated with woodcut-like starkness, minus the hedges and the qualifications that are addressed to other specialists. I might note here that this kind of scholarship is increasingly rare in academia, and perhaps we can discuss afterwards why that may be so. So in today's talk, I'm going to give you a brief biography of Goffman, the kind of intriguing character he was, introduce some of the key themes of this book, present some ideas from my own and others' research on ritual and the kind of dramaturgical elements of justice. And then I want to end kind of reflecting on seminars just like this. So here we are on Zoom. I don't know about you guys, but this is, I think, my 15th or 16th Zoom meeting this week. I teach online, I collaborate with my colleagues online, I keep in touch with family and friends online. My daughter has her Zoom dance class online. If there's one thing that we've gotten good at in the past 20 months, it's how to make social interaction work online. Goffman would have been very intrigued by this development. And I will end by sketching some ideas for thinking about how Goffman's insights can help us understand the nature of social interaction in a kind of post-COVID world. So, Goffman the Man. Goffman's arguably the 20th century's most well-known and widely read sociologist. He was born in Alberta in Canada in 1922 to Ukrainian Jewish immigrant parents. His family moved to Winnipeg when he was a boy. He started off doing a degree in chemistry at the University of Manitoba before discovering sociology and switching to the University of Toronto to finish his undergraduate degree. He then moved to Chicago to pursue his PhD in sociology, which he completed in 1953. So it's really important to kind of get that context, because during that period, Chicago was already really well known as the place to be for a certain kind of sociology, the Chicago School of Sociology. They pioneered urban ethnography and encouraged a generation of sociologists to get out into the field and to study up close the interpersonal dynamics of social life, of city life. While much of this work from this area is based on research in and around Chicago, Goffman kind of characteristically rejects that and heads off to a remote island in the Shetland Islands to complete his fieldwork for his PhD. Goffman then worked at the National Institute of Mental Health in Baltimore, at UC Berkeley, and then in 1968 moved to the University of Pennsylvania. He was a prolific scholar. He wrote about 8 or 10 books during this period. He wrote about stigma, about ritual, about behavior in public places, about the performance of gender, about how we frame social interaction. So that's kind of like the standard Wikipedia version of the biography, but it doesn't really tell you much about what kind of person he was. He was notoriously difficult, idiosyncratic, and eccentric. Rumors swirl around about him, with generations of sociologists trading stories about their awkward or trying interactions with him. His ghost looms large at Penn, where I was a PhD student in the early 2000s. I remember my first year of my PhD in an advanced theory seminar, and I'll never forget my professor, who was an emeritus professor at the time, kind of spending 3 hours telling us Goffman stories, Goffman gossip, right? Stories about the outrageous things he would say in seminars, or his uncouth behavior at dinner parties. He was known as a man who seemed to enjoy making other people uncomfortable, as if by breaking the ordinary rules of polite society, he was demonstrating an important lesson in microsociology. In the sociology building on campus, there was a corridor that was lined with the portraits of all the distinguished professors throughout the history of Penn. These portraits all looked the same, mostly men, white, old, largely indistinguishable, right? You know the image in their formal suits, holding their glasses or a pen, posing at their desk, in front of their scholarly works. The portrait of Goffman, though also white, male, and middle-aged, stood out from the rest. Goffman slightly disheveled. It's not this image that you see in front of you. I couldn't find, it looks like this, but it's not quite this image. He appears disheveled, he's in casual clothes, he's standing next to a desk that's strewn with paper, books, and magazines. He's staring at the camera with wide eyes and a surprised expression, as if the photographer caught him unawares. One gets the impression that he had a kind of impatience for ceremonies, such as official portraiture. The sociologist Dimitri Shalin, who manages the open source Goffman archive at the University of Las Vegas, wrote of Goffman, "Goffman was a student of civility whose standards he flouted. His demeanor was sometimes intentionally demeaning, his deference willfully deferred, and his incivility painfully obvious to those present." Basically, he was an eccentric who, maybe intentionally, interacted with his peers and his students in a way that drew attention to the unspoken rules of interaction. His behavior is often interpreted as a kind of reaching experiment, which is a term coined by his contemporary, the ethnomethodologist Harold Garfinkel, which are instances where minor social rules are broken on purpose in order to observe the social reaction to such an infraction. So while he was kind of an eccentric oddball, he also mentored and inspired a generation of microsociologists. The Goffman archive, which is available online, assembled by Dimitri Shalin, I would highly, if you want a deep dive into all things Goffman, I'd highly recommend it. It's a treasure trove of information with transcripts of interviews from his former colleagues, students, and other associates. They paint a picture of a brilliant and difficult person. Notably, he refused to get involved in political debates of his day. He had nothing to say about the Vietnam War, about civil rights, about race, about gender, even though his insights on the microdynamics of power and stratified social interactions have been embraced by many, many who seek to overthrow traditional social orders. Goffman died young at age 60 of stomach cancer. He was at the height of his fame and authority within the profession. That year, 1982, he was the president of the American Sociological Association, and his presidential address was written just before his death. And it was likely that he was aware of the fact that he would not be around to deliver it. It was read posthumously at the conference and became an instant classic. So about the presentation of self. This was his first book based on his PhD. This book, like all of his other books, explored different aspects of what he came to call the interaction order, or the common rules and the expectations of behavior that group members use to moderate their social relations and to make sense of their world. The sociologist Shamus Khan recently reflected back on reading this book for the first time when he was an undergraduate in the 1990s. And he tells a story of how when he checked it out at his university library, he noticed on the first page, a previous student had left a message for future readers. The message said, "This is the most painfully fucking obvious book ever written." As Khan notes, not an auspicious beginning. I'll summarize some of these ideas for you, and then you can tell me how obvious it is. The first concept that Goffman plays with is this idea of the definition of the situation. This is not Goffman's term. It comes from sociologists who were working at Chicago in the decades before Goffman, who helped develop the theory or the family of theories around what's now called symbolic interactionism. Essentially, sociologists, philosophers, social psychologists were concerned with understanding the relationship between the self, the mind, social interaction, and social structures. W.I. Thomas, along with his wife, Dorothy Swain Thomas, were Chicago sociologists researching and writing in the 1920s, and they developed what is now known as the Thomas theorem, which is taught in all first-year undergraduate sociology courses. The Thomas theorem is that if men define situations as real, then they are real in their consequences. This statement has both theoretical and methodological implications. As a theory, paying attention to the definition of the situation leads us to the realization that there may be multiple realities that are experienced and interpreted differently by different people at different times and in different contexts. These interpretations need to be understood and attended to. This is a really important idea in sociology, and particularly in my discipline of criminology, which prior to this period tended to view deviance and crime. Criminology prior to this time tended to view deviance and crime as either a simple rational calculation to offend or not offend, or an indication of some biological or psychological impairment. Chicago sociologists rejected the idea that criminals or deviants were either poor decision makers or biological inferiors, and instead sought to understand the social organization of disadvantaged and high crime communities. So of course, Chicago, with its high levels of urbanization, industrialization, migration, was a perfect laboratory. The second point to make about the definition of the situation is methodological. If what we're interested in is how people define their situation, then we need to go out and talk to people and observe them behaving in their social contexts that are familiar and comfortable to them. Goffman seems to have really taken this to heart, and the subtle perceptiveness of his keen observations have truly illuminated the study of social interaction. So the presentation of self really is all about an understanding of how people go about defining their situation and how they act once they get a correct read on that definition. The definition of the situation reveals the statuses and roles of different parties, and it will signal to an interactant the appropriate approach to take, the level of deference that is required in this interaction, and so on. If interactants agree on a definition of the situation, then it's likely to run smoothly. If they don't agree, or if one interactant misreads the definition of the situation, then the interaction is likely to go awry. In many routinized interactions, the definition is well understood. So I, like many of you, I'm a teacher, right? And in the classroom, my role as a teacher and my students' role as learners are relatively straightforward. Although I like to think that I have a friendly demeanor and that I tend towards being informal in my lectures and my interactions with students, my status relative to them is clear to all of us. But even this agreed upon definition of the situation, cracks appear. So for example, I feel a twinge of annoyance whenever a student starts an email to me with just a hi without a proper salutation. I'm also very familiar with the excruciating silence that happens when you ask a question that sinks heavily into a room with no student able or willing to offer a contribution. These are very small examples of interactants not holding up their end of the bargain, and they reveal the struggle over developing a shared definition of the situation. So one of Goffman's key insights is that this happens all the time. We are always getting the definition of the situation slightly wrong and slipping up in some subtle way. Interactions rarely run as smoothly as we imagine they might. We may say the wrong thing, we may speak out of turn, we may accidentally insult someone, we may be inappropriately patronizing, we may accidentally observe or overhear something that we aren't supposed to. The way we smooth this out is what Goffman calls impression management. These are the subtle ways that we get interactions back on track. This is the information game that the Shetland visitor is playing when he dons his expectant and warm smile long before he approaches the house he's visiting. This book is such a good read because it's chock full of these everyday examples that immediately resonate with our situation, with situations that we've been in. Examples of what Goffman calls defensive practices or protective practices that safeguard the definition of the situation and the impression that one is trying to give off. The main way that Goffman explored the contours of this information game is through the metaphor of dramaturgy. Goffman famously introduced the concept of front stage and backstage behavior, and also all of the other appropriate terminology to go along with that. So the setting, the staging, the props, the costume, the players, the audience, and so on. In the front region, we present the self that is consistent with the definition that we seek to project. So in the classroom, I perform the role of competent, knowledgeable, and approachable teacher who's passionate about the topic. This is true even if I'm underprepared, underslept, stressed, or actually not even interested at all in the course material. My students are the audience members, but they're also on stage with me as team members contributing to this performance. These activities are what Goffman calls coordinated events. We work together to make social interaction work. Goffman explains that together, participants contribute to a single overall definition of the situation, which involves not so much a real agreement as to what exists, but rather a real agreement as to whose claim regarding what issues will be temporarily honored. This is what he calls a working consensus. And that working consensus, of course, changes from interaction to interaction depending on different definitions of the situation. So on the front stage, identities are asserted, acknowledged, challenged, negotiated, and renegotiated in a never-ending cycle of situation defining. The collaborative nature of this front stage act is apparent everywhere. We rely on others to legitimate and affirm our self-presentation. One way this is done is through tact, or a willingness not to see the slip-ups of others. And I put up the work of Jane Austen here because I think she's probably the master of demonstrating how tact, or its opposite, is used in everyday social interaction. Goffman also gives us the wonderful concept of what he calls studied non-observance, or when we studiously ignore other interactants' breaches. So for instance, if in polite company someone mispronounces a word or underdresses for the occasion or accidentally makes an offensive comment. If the definition of the situation is one where friends are gathering on equal terms, then we tend to see such non-observance. If an interactant seeks to demonstrate status or power over another, then these mistakes may be pointed out. And again, look to Austen for endless examples of this. I'm sure you can all think of examples in your own life where you've experienced the tact or the non-tact of others. When we're not performing on the front stage, we move to the back. This is where we kind of let our hair down, where we relax, where we prepare for upcoming roles, we work on our props, we rehearse our lines. Backstage is relative. We are in a kind of backstage when we're at home with our intimates. We may not think of ourselves as performing when we're with our intimates, but this is still a different kind of back region to the one that we're in when we're truly by ourselves. So I want to pause here and consider whether or not this seems all just a bit shallow. Is it really just painfully obvious? Yeah, we play roles, manners are important, and keep social interaction well-oiled. Yeah, we work together to make social interaction run smoothly. Yeah, it's true that we're a different person when we're out in public versus when we're at home with our loved ones. And there's this tendency to be kind of a bit critical, to see Goffman as kind of just a cheeky trickster who's pointing out the obvious, or making it seem like we're all self-interested strategizers, or who have kind of like Machiavellian tendencies when we interact with others. But this is only part of the story. Sociologists, most notably Emil Durkheim, in the early 20th century, were very preoccupied with the role that ritual plays in social life. I define ritual as a series of repeated acts or actions that are well staged, symbolically charged, and full of tradition. They often mark critical turning points in your life, and they have a sacred and timeless quality. And they reaffirm participants' commitment to a shared moral order, a shared normative order. Commonly, we think of things like religious services, sporting events, political rallies, or other big formal rituals. And they're often conceived as a space where social order is constituted, right? Now, I do research in courts, where the ritual element has long been recognized. This is a picture of the Old Bailey in London. The oak paneling in a courtroom, which harkens back to the ancient British oak trees where kings sat to administer the king's justice. The traditional robes, which were a direct descendant of ecclesiastical dress. The coat of arms is a symbol of monarchical power, or arguably symbols of colonial power and state violence. the formal language focused on procedure, the long training that legal professionals undertake. All of this speaks to court spaces as sites where ritual transformations take place. So for instance, defendants become criminals, right? Or where certain values are communicated, the rule of law, democracy, power, violence, and so on. These kind of rituals are formal and weighty, and they're meant to bind us to our community and remind us what we as a society hold sacred, what our sacred values are. However, and this is Goffman's point, rituals don't have to be so heavy, so weighty with symbols, weighing these formal big events. Goffman recalibrates ritual into a mundane interaction that actually offers a similar glimpse into the sacred. In Goffman's formulation, everyday interactions, such as acquaintances greeting each other on the street, or people standing outside a restaurant together, smoking a cigarette, all of that reaffirms a commitment to a shared normative order. I put up the image here of Randall Collins's book, Interaction Ritual Chains. Collins is a contemporary social theorist working in this tradition, and indeed he devotes a whole chapter to smoking rituals, Goffmanian kind of style analysis of smoking rituals in his book. So Goffman coins the term interaction ritual here. These interaction rituals are often informal, they're fleeting, they seem to happen spontaneously, but he points out that these are just as important as the more formal version of ritual when it comes to creating a sense of shared membership in a community or sense of solidarity. So was the university student correct? The one who read the presentation of self as the most painfully fucking obvious book ever written? Well, you can tell me that in the questions and answer afterwards, but what Seamus Khan writes about the book, he says, the revelation of Goffman remains for me both intellectual and affective. Goffman opened up worlds. The preceding owner of my copy of presentation was right. Once you read Goffman, it's astonishing how obvious it all is. But like so many transformative ideas, its key point is only obvious once someone shows it to you, and then you feel as if you knew it all along. So I mentioned earlier that I do research in courts in the justice system. Courtroom interaction seems to communicate a very clear definition of the situation, one where judges and legal professionals share high status, they share a monopoly on arcane knowledge and power over a large number of arguably vulnerable people who pass through the courtroom. This theater of the court is well articulated in the architecture, the design, and the rituals in the court. But I'm also interested in other kinds of rituals, justice rituals, perhaps ones where this definition of the situation is kind of flipped or is more empowering for victims and offenders. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I've drawn on Goffman in my own work on the ritual and emotional dynamics of restorative justice, or face-to-face meetings between victims and offenders of crime. Across a range of studies, I've tried to map the ritual dynamics of the interaction, notably focusing on how people in high conflict situations interact with each other directly without lawyers or judges, and how emotions like anxiety, shame, anger, and remorse somehow over careful discussions of accountability and harm morph into a sense of solidarity and collective optimism. I've observed kind of countless restorative justice conferences over the years, and something that I've commonly observed is the most Goffmanian of social rituals, which is people having a cup of tea together and chatting about sports at the end of a conference. After an intense couple of hours of talking in depth about the impact of a particular offense and working together to agree on a positive way forward, this informal ritual, this drinking tea and talking about sports, can be a profound demonstration of a revised definition of the situation. So I've briefly outlined some of his key ideas, and in this last kind of couple of minutes, I want to talk about impression management in a virtual world. Do you think that our understanding of social interaction has changed over the past 20 months? We know that new technologies have long influenced how we communicate, but this pace seems to have sped up dramatically when we went into lockdown, when most of the world went into lockdown in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We were no longer engaging in everyday face-to-face interactions with strangers, friends, and colleagues. These everyday interaction rituals were not there to charge us up with feelings of solidarity or community. How have we coped? How have other forms of interaction, including Zoom interaction, video interaction, or socially distant masked communication, change how we present ourselves or how we distinguish between the front and back region? I'll end this talk by talking about this new information game and how this information game that Goffman observed is changing. So I'll first talk about Zoom. This past year and a half, we all became very familiar with Zoom, both in formal settings, such as catching up with friends and family, or more formal settings like teaching, meetings, or seminars like this. We've already developed certain cultural touchstones that already provide a shared symbolic resonance, such as the knowing glances that people give each other, or the studied non-observance in Zoom meetings when someone begins talking with their microphone muted. I've heard so many self-deprecating jokes about forgetting to unmute your microphone that they've taken on their own ritual forms. There's also a real risk of a Goffmanian slippage between our front region persona and our backstage actions whenever we work remotely anywhere that children are around. This image, I hope you all remember. This was this was the first, long before COVID, this is 2017, the viral video about accidentally revealing our backstage to our audience, in this case, live on the BBC. This was an academic who was being interviewed live on the BBC while his daughter barged in. There's something both terrifying and comforting about this. We're keen to put our best face forward, in social interaction to make a good impression, right? Which is why during the pandemic, the sales of ring lights have skyrocketed, and Zoom and other companies now offer backdrops so that we don't have to reveal our backstage to colleagues or students. But it's also been somehow comforting to see over this past year and a half, our colleagues' pets, or people dressed informally, or people with unwashed hair, or people revealing the fact that they're wearing pajama bottoms underneath, right? A glimpse into their backstage actually seems to create solidarity. The feeling that this evokes is in the same family, not quite the same, but in the same family as that Instagram phenomenon where the backstage and front stage seem to merge, as social media users idealize a front stage presentation of the backstage. So for instance, where authenticity is communicated by carefully disheveled, but still highly aspirational self-presentation. I would argue that our collective experience of Zoom life can be seen as a demonstration of this kind of what happens when we lose a little bit of control over our ability to define the situation, and the ways this can be disconcerting. My favorite example of this actually comes from the world of courts, and I hope that for those of you who are watching, this brings back that wonderful feeling that you all had back in February of this year when this video went viral, which is a video of a lawyer in the US whose filter was stuck in cat mode, and he was forced to make his submission to a judge dressed or appearing as a cat. So in some ways, gaffes such as this and others, and the justice system and beyond, have been shared so widely because on the one hand, they provide comic relief in a really shit year, right? But they also seem to tap into this kind of shared discomfort with the adjustments that are currently taking place to changing modes of interaction. I'm currently doing research on the ritual dynamics of justice on virtual courts, trying to understand how symbols and rituals of justice have been reimagined or challenged as they move online. Courts have been a place where hierarchy is very clearly communicated, right? The judge on the bench, the lawyers at a bar table, the defendant in a dock. Zoom is a flatter form of interaction, right? Everyone's just a box, everyone's a box the same size on the screen. This changes the definition of the situation ever so slightly to one that is perhaps counterintuitively more participatory or easier to access. I put this image up here. This is one of my favorite images. It's a professional photograph from the UK. It's a swearing in of a Supreme Court justice during COVID. And what you can see is kind of the rich color and symbol of the UK Supreme Court. This is the Judicial Library. However, note that the tiny camera at the top of the laptop where the president of the court is actually swearing in this new justice will reveal only a tiny portion of this, right? So all of the staging and the props and the choreography of a grand formal ritual, but the less than ideal technology will translate it into something completely different for viewers. It's also possible that Zoom will make it less likely that that Goffmanian working consensus will converge. I haven't observed this yet in courts. I've been observing courts during COVID, and most of the time, there's been no kind of breaches occurring. Everyone seems to still be on their best behavior. But in the education context, on average, we know there's pretty good data from around the world that students find online teaching to be a diminished experience. And indeed, in the early stages of online teaching, there was a report from high schools in America of an increase in the number of absences and also an increase on the number of pranks on unpopular teachers. So pranks such as Zoom bombing, all the students agreeing to turn off their cameras at the same time, disruptive behavior, etc. Perhaps in-person interactions more readily result in a working consensus or more conformity, and a Goffmanian style front stage show of respect for the situation, so how you're supposed to respect your teachers, for example, and a mild form of solidarity. Arguably, that kind of social pressure to conform disappears at a distance. It's also possible that Zoom sends too many signals. This is Zoom fatigue. Where concentrating on someone's face at the expense of all other ambient features of an interaction is draining. Being able to see yourself is a source of strain, right? Goffman points out that we're all concerned with putting our best foot forward, but normally as conversation flows, people tend to become less self-conscious and they focus more on others. This is harder to do when there's a small picture of yourself at the bottom of the screen. Arguably, while self-view may allow you to check on your self-presentation, it makes the two-sided nature of conversation more stilted. Informally, I've heard from colleagues and students that they prefer the Zoom, their self-view to be turned off if they really need to focus on what's on their screen. What about masked interactions? You might remember the first, I don't know if everyone's here from the ACT, but probably most people on this call have been in a lockdown of some point. I remember the first day after this most recent mask mandate, going for a walk outside, wearing my mask, and making meaningful eye contact with every other Canberran that walked past. Solidarity was high at first. We seemed keen to acknowledge each other with a wave or an eye contact. This is a departure from what Goffman called civil inattention, which is the polite ignoring of other people in public spaces. In general, there's a well-documented temporary rise in solidarity and a ritual coming together in the wake of some great upheaval or great tragedy. And this seems to be a variation on this impulse. There have been studies of masked interactions between strangers in California and in the UK, noting the same phenomena of increased acknowledgement between strangers in the early days of lockdown. There's also evidence of a so-called COVID dance developing, where you go out of your way to give passersby space. That kind of behavior would have originally been experienced as rude before the pandemic, but now is a gesture of kindness. And we've all seen the footage of the ritualized singing, clapping, and noise-making around Europe at the height of lockdowns. This behavior waned over time as we've adjusted to new social orders. So I'm going to end with one final example of how self-presentation changed during the pandemic. Lockdown quickly put a stop to sexual relations outside of cohabiting people or people who are already in a relationship. Lovers or potential lovers have a long history of exchanging intimate photographs of themselves, but in recent years, again pre-COVID, this form of interaction has changed dramatically, with a huge number of young people taking part in this phenomenon of sexting, right? These photos that are shared amongst young people are often kind of context-free close-ups of breasts or genitalia. And from a Goffmanian perspective, I would imagine that it's actually quite hard to get a read on the definition of the situation, right, from these gestures. But during the lockdown period, there have been some reports of a shift in how we make and share naked pictures of ourselves. At least some people have reported that the extra time at home and the inability to physically meet with others has resulted in them putting more time into creative and artistic nude images. Some also report an increased willingness to share these images with the people they know less well. So, in a New York Times article on this phenomenon, one respondent noted, sending a nude selfie is a request to be witnessed, not objectively through rose-tinted or smooth-filtered lenses. When I choose to be seen in this way, I'm taking an empowered action to receive what we all desire. And what we desire even more now in COVID times is a witness to our own vulnerability and to our most private truth. So I'm going to end on this idea of being witnessed and this idea of private truths and what Goffman would have made of this. This idea that we're all performers, that all the world's a stage, can be interpreted cynically, right? And indeed, many have accused Goffman of such cynicism, but by emphasizing the performative nature of social interaction, wherein we are presenting idealized versions of ourselves. But perhaps the performance is the truth. It's through these front stage performances and also glimpses into the backstage that we create, challenge, and reimagine the social world. The performance is not just a biased and idealized version of reality, as Goffman says, it's a way of creating reality. And in that moment, when the performance is accepted as reality, it can have some characteristics of celebration, creating solidarity and shared commitments. So to help make sense of this, Goffman, in the presentation of self, invokes the ritual of a wedding. Sure, it's true that weddings are artificial and idealized performances, but indeed that performative aspect is essential to what makes them so valuable. We know these rituals, we hold these rituals to represent something true and good. Goffman's point is that this holds true with all kinds of interactions, big and small. In his words, and I'll end with this quote from him, to stay in one's room away from the place where the party is given, or away from where the practitioner attends to his client, is to stay away from where reality is being performed. The world, in truth, is a wedding. I think I'll end with that, and I'm happy to talk about whatever anyone wants to talk about.
Thank you very much, Meredith. So we're very happy to have your questions and comments. Please use the Q&A function or the chat function at the bottom of the screen here. Can I first ask about the contemporary use of Goffman? I have to say, as a sociologist myself, most of the references that I see to Goffman in contemporary literature are, I suppose, what you would call kind of ceremonial. There's a gesture towards Goffman and his concepts, but it's not a sort of close engagement. It's almost the sense that people have encountered him as an undergraduate. We have a vague idea, but it's not necessarily something that, he's not in vogue either currently or to be rediscovered or something like that. But can you give us a better sense of how social scientists are engaging with Goffman?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one response to that is that when I do happen to meet other people at sociology conferences or something who are interested in Goffman, we do have an immediate shared affinity, which suggests that it's like less common in social sciences today. But I would argue that there's actually a pretty vibrant move, particularly in the sociology of emotions, that kind of, I guess, really like reimagines some of that dramaturgical stuff in the contemporary landscape. I'm thinking in particular around the work around emotional labor and the performance of gender and all of that, which I think does rely heavily on Goffman in a real and meaningful way that I think is really fruitful. I'd also say, and I'm not I enjoy talking about Zoom, but I'm not a scholar of like social media. And I think there is a pretty rich area of scholarship around stuff I was referring to around kind of like Instagram and social media and TikTok and really reimagining some of that like front stage, backstage stuff emerging in the kind of contemporary mediated interactions. And I guess the final area that does relate to my research is this reimagining, again, about technology, reimagining what it means to be present with someone or co-present with someone. And that's something that Goffman kind of takes face-to-face present interaction for granted. But I think there's a whole generation of sociologists of technology that are reimagining co-presence and how rituals unfold in space and time in all sorts of interesting ways. And so I think that those are kind of fruitful areas. But you're totally, and indeed, I in that kind of Seamus Khan article I mentioned where he talks about his experience of reading Goffman as an undergraduate, he makes reference to something about how it's the kind of book that undergraduates read, and this was my experience too, and it really inspires them. And then they go to graduate school and do their PhD, and they're like kind of, it's all like beaten out of them, that kind of like that they have to be more specialized and more focused, and like have this is the way you do sociology, right? And that you can't work like Goffman, you can't write like Goffman.
And it's it's something that you said. I mean, we also welcome the Q&A and chat questions here. But you mentioned he's writing it in the 50s, and it's an interesting time because the boundaries between sociology and social psychology are not firm yet. Even the boundaries between sociology and anthropology are not firm yet. Yeah. So scholars from that area, I mean, I've done a lot of work on J. Milton Yinger, who was sort of contemporary of that period. They had so much more freedom, partly because there was comparatively little in their fields.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's the case for you today, but I can't keep up with the work in my relatively narrow area of the social sciences. And I have, colleagues from sort of anthropology who tell me that there is the current sort of book, the current sort of must-read book. A few years ago, it was Anna Singh's book about mushrooms in capitalism.
Mushrooms at the end of the world, yeah.
Oh, you must have read. When would I get time to do this? But back then, there was relatively little information, relatively sort of porous boundaries between the disciplines. Yeah. It led to a sort of freedom. Do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. And, Goffman's kind of famously kind of short on scholarly referencing in his book. But what I did notice this time around is that what he does tend to reference is other Chicago PhDs. And these are all his contemporaries who are this is that generation of like, the kind of Howard Becker generation, all the people who were trained by Hughes, who all went out into the field, all did different ethnographic work in different areas of like social life, and all read each other's work and all published in the same journal. And it was like, and that was it. It was a really closed community. I think there was only two. It was the American Journal of Sociology and the American Sociological Review were the only journals at the time. So yeah, it was really easy to kind of have that grasp. And I should also, one small note about Goffman, about his prickly personality. He played on that too. And I think later on, as that anthropology and sociology division perhaps started to divide a bit more, he took sides, if you will, in that when he was appointed at Penn in the late 60s, he was a joint professor of sociology and anthropology. But at that point, he had decided that like he didn't like the kind of structural kind of positivist dominance of sociology or where it was moving. So he wanted to affiliate with himself with the anthropologists. So he refused to take on any sociology PhD students. And again, there's these stories of like sociology students sitting at the door, like listening to his seminars because he wouldn't let them in the room because he only wanted to talk to anthropologists. So.
But it was also a time when, talking about his eccentricity, it was a time when, for white male professors, they were indulged in a way that is not the case now. I mean, the way you described him, it sounded very similar to another social scientist who passed away not too long ago. Some people know who I'm talking about, who was also famously disheveled and eccentric. It was tolerated far more than less celebrated contemporary scholars, but far less than it was back in the day. And I'm sure there's sort of gender elements to that there. But we've got two questions.
I see.
From Penny.
Did Goffman and Labov drink it? Yeah, I'm sure they did. I'm pretty sure that they were contemporaries, and they would have known each other. And indeed, I don't know if this is an appropriate place for it, but I think this is relatively known. Goffman's wife, after he died, actually remarried Bill Labov. So there was definitely close sort of circles. and would have, yes, strongly influenced each other.
A question from Katie, who's intrigued about what you think is Goffman's main preoccupation in studying the minutiae of social performance. From what you say at the end, he perhaps is most interested in the cooperative endeavor, building a shared existence, and how much negotiation this requires. Or is he interested in, say, power asymmetries?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's interested in both those things. But I would argue that the larger project is trying to, this idea of interaction ritual and the interaction order is to show that those minute, everyday rituals of manners actually like have something really powerful and profound to say about the social structure. And so Randall Collins, who kind of works in this tradition, argues for what he calls a radical microsociology. And so we often think of rituals as something that just like reflect the social structure, right? And that's kind of the traditional anthropological definition of a ritual, is like an upside down triangle with a ritual at the bottom and social structure at the top. And Collins argues that Goffman is trying to flip that and say that it's like rituals constitute social order. So I think that probably the idea of solidarity and arguably that's achieved through through the kind of cooperative endeavor or shared existence is key. But I think the thing about power imbalance is really important, because solidarity is not just about like us having a good interaction and feeling good, cooperating and feeling good about it. It's also about having asymmetrical interactions that are good for some people, but less good for others, that kind of reaffirm power and status for people who already have power and status, and that are degrading rituals for people who don't. So there's that too.
And there is something, almost sort of totalitarian in this sort of worldview that life and interactions are, a constant threat of shame. In these sort of interactions. Yeah. He was a kind of, one of his kind of most famous essays is about embarrassment and social organization, and writing about the things we do to avoid being embarrassed, and the role of, how things like shame and embarrassment are contagious, and the kind of lengths we go to address that. The question from Katie Kirchin: Goffman's insights seem very closely connected to the concept of microaggressions, which has become a widely understood term in the 21st century. Did Goffman write about microaggressions, but perhaps using a different term?
Yeah, he definitely didn't use that term. And that's actually kind of similar to the previous question, because I think microaggressions are ways of demonstrating power asymmetries, which I think he was probably less concerned with. But I put up the image of from Jane Austen, and he I'm sure he refers to Austen in her book, but I think that like kind of novelists of like the 18th and 19th century that kind of are novelists of manners and emotions seem to do like a really, really good job of unpacking what we now call microaggressions. And certainly Goffman was influenced by that.
Well, we're running up to 6:30, so thank you very much, Meredith, for your presentation this evening, and thank you all to our participants for your attention and for your questions and answers. Our next event is in Thursday next week at 5 p.m. in our Works That Shaped the World series, not books that changed humanity, works that shaped the world. And we welcome Rachel and Kenny, who's Professor of History and Philosophy at the University of Adelaide, who will be discussing the development of the idea of the model organism in biology. So moving from the social sciences to the natural sciences, and that's next Thursday at 5 p.m. And the host of that session next Thursday, I'm very pleased to say, because we just received an email about that, is the new head of the Humanities Research Center, Professor Kylie Message. And as the new head of the Research School of Humanities and Arts, Professor Kate Mitchell emails. Kylie brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the role, having previously been head of various sort of acronyms. Most importantly, Kylie is a leading scholar in museum studies with an outstanding track record of highly interdisciplinary scholarship. She has strong collaborations with and connections to the glam sector. She's just texted that she's going to kill me. But she's a strong advocate for humanities research, so she can't. As we begin to imagine emerging from the pandemic, Kylie is ideally positioned to lead the HRC into an exciting new chapter. So we'll welcome Kylie as the official new head of the HRC next week, as well as we welcome Rachel and Kenny from the University of Adelaide. And thank you again, Professor Meredith Rossner.
Thanks so much. That was great.